This is the NBC Television Network.
NBC, let's all be there.
I think I'm aware of people who are trying to take advantage of my husband, who are trying to end run him lots of times, who are trying to use him. I'm very aware of that. All my little antennas go up.
Nancy Reagan, without her, Dad probably wouldn't be president of the United States.
I think that she wanted him to be president probably more than he wanted to be president.
She can be a handful. I mean, she's not always the easiest person to get along with.
That phone there rang, you know, right now, and she was on it, and she'd say, Stu, I want you to jump. I'd say, how high?
Nancy Reagan at the peak of her power and the peak of her popularity. In the polls these days, she does even better than her husband. In Washington's corridors of power, she's a respected and feared political operative. It hasn't been easy. In 1981, she was attacked for her fancy lifestyle. They called her Queen Nancy. Now she is seen in far less glamorous settings, trying to keep children off drugs. Some critics still say she's old-fashioned, that she lives through her husband. But this spring, she swept into St. Peter's Square in Rome, leading an entourage like a visiting head of state, taking her anti-drug campaign worldwide in a meeting with the Pope. The First Lady's visit to the Vatican was the climax of a highly sophisticated White House effort over the last 3 years to give Mrs. Reagan a more compassionate, less frivolous public image. But it was more than just public relations. It was also one more stage in Nancy Reagan's personal development. No longer just Ronald Reagan's wife, she has grown into an interesting public figure in her own right. Tonight, a look at the emerging Nancy Reagan, the former actress who has become expert at the role of First Lady, the wife who has discovered she has power and likes it.
This is an NBC News special. Reported by Chris Wallace. This NBC News special is sponsored in part by Sun Company, where there's sun, there's energy.
From all over the world, crude oil comes to this Sun Company refinery where we make Sunoco products. Since Sun produces nearly 10 million gallons of gasoline a day, one of the most important jobs we have is safety, and not just at work. Many of us use our safety training as volunteer firemen in our community. All right, you guys, let's go. At Sun, we think putting our energy back into the community is just as important as getting it out.
Where there's sun, there's energy.
Help the hair, uncover your highlight. Help the hair, discover your glow. Help the hair, every color of hair can be. Help the hair.
Elsa, 5 new Swedish botanical shampoos and conditioners.
Elsa Marigold highlights blonde. Ginger root lights the fire of red.
Help the hair, uncover your highlight. Help the hair, discover your glow. Help the hair.
Uncover your highlights, discover your glow. Elsa.
Well,
It's the final hours before a state dinner for the president of Algeria.
we have to have the receiving line. Here.
And Nancy Reagan makes sure everything is right. During her husband's presidency, Mrs. Reagan has changed the White House to reflect her taste for elegance. But the biggest change in the White House these days involves the First Lady herself. The old Nancy Reagan, who preferred the background, who talked almost exclusively about her role as wife, she is a thing of the past. The new First Lady conducts her own press briefings about her own activities, especially fighting drug abuse.
The idea that this is a global problem, not just a problem here. I think
Today, it takes a personal staff of 15 to keep track of Mrs. Reagan's trips, speeches, and projects.
July and August, you know, I got a call about November today. November.
And for the first time, the First Lady is now publicly emerging as a top advisor, a key player in her husband's administration.
Do you know who that is? The leader of the free world. And she bought her husband.
That is a perception that long bothered Mrs. Reagan, that she has had a major influence on her husband's career as politician, governor, and president. It's a perception that has been fueled by some of her husband's closest advisors.
She has power. You get power in several ways, but two of them are access and leverage. And she has access.
She has as much clout as she wants to. I think if she wants to weigh in on something, it certainly becomes the focus on his agenda, and certainly can become the focus of a lot of other attention around the White House.
For years, Mrs. Reagan denied she had anything to do with her husband's business. But when we talked recently in the White House living room, we found something new. A confident, assertive First Lady who has clout, especially in the area of personnel, and doesn't mind if people know it.
I think I'm aware of people who are trying to take advantage of my husband, who are trying to end run him lots of times, who are trying to use him. I'm very aware of that. All my little antennas go up.
More aware than he is?
Uh-huh.
Why? Is he more trusting than you are?
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe he's just too busy thinking of other things, and it never occurs to him that that's what they're doing.
And what happens when you see that's what they're doing?
I try to stop it.
How?
By telling him or by telling somebody else.
She's a very shrewd judge of character and has a real sort of bloodhound's instinct for people's hidden agendas. The bottom line for my mom is this person hurting my father or helping him? And once she's come down on one side or the other, then she's going to be either a very powerful ally or an enemy you don't want to have.
While Mrs. Reagan denied involvement in any specific case we mentioned, top White House officials say she's been very involved. They say she was a major figure in helping push Alexander Haig and William Clark out of the cabinet, and in helping Mike Deaver and James Baker gain control of the first-term White House staff. They say she has generally sided with moderates over hardline conservatives, more interested in seeing her husband win than in ideology. And they say Mrs. Reagan gets involved in personnel problems because Mr. Reagan doesn't like to.
He's a patsy in personal relationships. He's easy. He's tough on ideological questions, and tough on policy questions, but he has a very difficult time with personnel questions.
He doesn't complain until it really reaches a point where it's gone much too far, in my opinion.
Yes, it's difficult for me if there is some disciplining that is needed, or even some change of personnel.
It sounds like he does occasionally hope that maybe you'll take that burden off his hands.
No.
It's harder for him.
In other words, I'm a soft touch.
The president's not the type of person that's going to come down in the morning and say, Stu, you really screwed up. He just won't do that. But he might say that to Nancy. Boy, Stu, I think you really screwed up on that one the other day. She'd call me up and say, Spencer, you really screwed up. And you get the message.
But Mrs. Reagan is not the boss and doesn't always get her way. After the 1984 election, she told us, she wanted a purge of the cabinet to get rid of people who had outlived their usefulness. Instead, the president asked the entire cabinet to stay on. Still, if she doesn't win them all, the First Lady is a tough infighter.
You have been both her friend and her enemy, haven't you?
That is correct.
How tough an enemy is she?
She's a good one. She's tough.
Stu Spencer helped start Mr. Reagan in politics and is still one of his closest advisors. But in 1976, he ran Gerald Ford's campaign against the Reagans.
How tough did she make life for you?
I don't think I even talked to her in that period of time.
I
I was a leper.
Stu Spencer, who has been your great friend and your adversary at various times, says you can also be a very tough enemy.
Well, I don't know about that. If I'm upset about something that somebody's done, I tend to just pull back. A curtain comes down. I don't yell and shout and throw things, and I just pull back.
We have heard that occasionally you won't talk to somebody for a couple of days when you're mad at them.
Well, that's pulling back.
I'll say. But it blows over?
Sure.
There are stories that there was one period of about 6 months when she wouldn't talk to you.
Make it about 3 months. People tend to exaggerate.
Are you all a little scared of her?
Scared is a funny term. I think we certainly respect her, and I certainly think that you know that if she has a concern about something, it goes to the top of the priority list as opposed to the bottom.
People I talk to say that you can be pretty demanding, that when you want something, you want it now, and in fact, one of the words that I heard repeatedly used about you is she can be relentless. True?
Well, I think I know what I want. But actually, I would think that if I were working for somebody, I would rather work for somebody who knew what they wanted.
And you don't leave any doubts?
No. But isn't that easier?
White House staffers rest anything but easy about what the First Lady says about them during her long hours alone with the President. And they might not have been reassured by this lunch at the Reagan Ranch, when the conversation turned to new Chief of Staff Donald Reagan.
Don Reagan, God told me he's golfed out.
He's golfed out? Well, I've got a couple of little things up here he could do. He could clear some brush, a little variety.
How do you clear brush with a golf club?
He could do a little riding, exercise some horses.
Mm-hmm.
You should have a change of pace. Don't you think?
Yeah.
Okay. You tell him.
While Mrs. Reagan is deeply involved in personnel, she generally stays out of policy matters, but not always. Worried last year about Democratic charges the president might get the U.S. in a war, Mrs. Reagan pushed her husband to cool his anti-Soviet rhetoric and to meet with Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko. Members of the National Security Council say she helped break an administration deadlock on Soviet policy between hardliners and moderates.
I didn't think it was fair when I'd pick up the paper and I'd read it that he was a warmonger, that he was ready to go to war and so on, when I know that that's completely untrue.
Her involvement in a policy matter of that nature was for the purpose of being reelected. I took the position that it was political suicide to keep up the hardball rhetoric. We didn't talk about the merit of it. We talked about the politics of it.
And she agreed with you?
Yes.
The First Lady's push paid big political dividends when Gromyko visited the White House during the fall campaign, blunting one of the Democrats' best issues. During a reception that day, Mrs. Reagan had an encounter of her own with Gromyko.
He turned and looked at me and said, "Is your husband in favor of peace or war?" And I said, "Peace." And he said, "You sure?" And I said, "I'm sure." And he said, "Well, then you whisper peace in his ear every night." And I said, "I will. I'll also whisper it in your ear."
Now safely past her husband's last election ever, Mrs. Reagan is not bashful about expressing opinions on the new generation of Soviet leaders.
Are you intrigued at all by Mikhail Gorbachev, the new Soviet leader, and his wife with their Western manner and their Western clothes?
Sure, everybody is.
Are you at all concerned that Gorbachev is a better propaganda spokesman for the Soviet Union? And, you know, the same ideology is there, is just in a much more attractive wrapping now.
I think that's so. I think he has, yes, that's more of a PR feel.
But
it's still the same philosophy.
Would you like to see a summit?
It would be nice if there were a meeting where the two men could just sit and talk. Just talk. Just to get a feel of each other. That would be a good idea. But I'm not talking a summit. I think a meeting should come first.
And a meeting is really just to get acquainted,
Just
size
to get
each other
acquainted,
up.
yeah.
And what's a summit?
Well, a summit, as I understand a summit, is where you have an agenda and you have specific things you're going to talk about.
But Mrs. Reagan is far more comfortable dealing with politics and what works best for her husband.
It would be great.
Want me to break a leg?
No, good luck.
All right.
Last month, she sent him off from the White House family quarters to announce his tax reform plan on national television. The political pros around the White House regard the First Lady as one of their own, a shrewd judge of how issues and politicians are received by the public, even if she is always the president's #1 cheerleader.
We include her in a lot of decision-making in the political process when we're in a campaign.
I think Nancy Reagan's probably got the best public relations instinct of any woman, or any people I've ever known, but certainly any woman. She's got very good personal gut instincts.
One case study was Mrs. Reagan's reaction to the first debate with Walter Mondale and the president's fumbling performance.
The system is still where it was with regard to the progressivity, as I've said.
She was upset, and everybody knew it. And rightly so.
How so? I mean, what did she chew people out? Or what, I mean, what
Well, I'm
went
not
on?
going to get into that. You'd have to ask her that.
I was upset.
Real
Yes,
upset.
I was upset.
Because?
Because I thought they'd gone about it all wrong. And they had.
In terms of preparing
Yeah,
the president.
Yeah. They overloaded him. He knows all those things. They don't have to overload him.
And were changes made?
Well, the second one was better, wasn't it?
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
But the First Lady created a problem herself in the last campaign when she seemed to prompt her husband in public. Some cases were minor, at this rally pointing out where the American flag was, but other cases were not.
She was very worried last summer when she prompted the president. You may remember the scene.
Is there anything you can do to get them to the enemy?
Doing everything you can.
Doing everything we can. And a lot of people were saying that the president was getting gaga and needed to be prompted by his wife, who was acting as his ventriloquist.
To this day, the Reagans say she was just talking to herself, not prompting the president.
She doesn't prompt you?
No.
Mr. President, how good a politician is Mrs. Reagan?
Absolutely sensational, don't you think so?
Took the words right out of my mouth.
I think she's prompting you again. You know, it's been suggested that you're a real motivating force in your involvement in politics, is you want people to love them as much as you do.
I think they do, though. Don't you? Maybe not all of them, but I do. Yes, I do.
You're being so good on your diet, you haven't cheated at all tonight. I guess that 12-hour appetite suppressant you took this morning is really working. But hasn't it been a lot longer than 12 hours since you took it? I mean, so what happens now? Does
If your appetite suppressant calls it a day before you do, you need Accutrim. Accutrim lasts longer than any other brand of appetite suppressant, a full 16 hours.
You know, this could really use some more chopped nuts. Oh, waiter!
Accutrim, it's at its strongest when you're at your weakest.
Okay, Mom, which hand has the newest idea in douches? Wrong. 2 Massengill vinegar and water douches. Right, new extra cleansing and extra mild. Now we have a choice of Massengill freshness. What's the difference? New extra cleansing. The only vinegar and water with PuraClean. PuraClean? For effective cleansing. And extra mild. The only douche with no additives. I've always trusted Massengill. Extra mild for me. I choose extra cleansing.
Trust Massengill, the leader for 73 years.
The GE electronic refrigerator. It speaks for itself.
We bring good things to life.
People get a lot of fish out of these waters, and Sun Company gets a lot of oil. Over 3 million barrels a year. We know that sea life was here long before we were. This is the drill. That's why we have practice drills like this. In case of a spill, our containment unit would quickly surround the oil and help prevent damage. At Sun, we think putting our energy back into the environment is as important as getting it out.
Where there's sun, there's energy.
As Nancy Reagan has become more secure as First Lady, she has been willing to take more chances. And yet, there is still a reserve there, even in her carefully orchestrated photo opportunities. A sense she's willing to reveal only so much of herself. People feel they know her husband, but getting to know Mrs. Reagan isn't as easy. We asked some of the people who know her best to describe her.
She's a very sensitive person. She's a very private person. She guards her privacy very jealously and doesn't like intrusions into that privacy. And when they happen, her thin skin makes her react, well, it hurts her.
She is probably one of the most caring people in the world and really cares about family and home life.
She can be a handful. I mean, she's not always the easiest person to get along with, I guess because of that sensitivity. She's a bit of a perfectionist. I don't think I'd want her to be my boss.
To understand Mrs. Reagan, where she comes from and what she cares about, a good place to start is her relationship with her mother. Edith Davis is now 88 and ailing. She lives in Arizona.
That's a good kiss.
How is your mother now?
Well, she's not well. The only good part about it is that she's not in any pain. That's the good part. But she's not well.
How often do you speak to her?
Every night.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
From the White House or?
Wherever.
And is that hard? Must be very hard for you now to see her beginning to fail.
Very hard.
Anne Frances Robbins was born in Manhattan. Her father, car dealer Kenneth Robbins, left the family within months. And her mother, who was an actress, left soon after.
She had to earn a living, and she couldn't take me touring all over the country with her.
So the child, nicknamed Nancy, was brought up by an aunt and uncle in Maryland. Mrs. Reagan says she was treated well, but remembers how much she missed her mother, especially when at age 4, she got double pneumonia.
And I wanted her so badly. And I said, well, if I ever have a child and she's sick, I'll certainly be with her. And of course, when this was told to my mother, my poor mother died.
But that, I mean, it must have been hard on you. I mean, and especially at times like that when you were sick and 4.
It was hard on me, it was hard on her.
The First Lady is not so understanding about her father. Relations between them were always strained.
I was always reluctant to talk about him when he was alive, because there was no point in hurting him. But this was a visit that I had, and as I remember, something had been said about my mother that I didn't like, and we got into an argument, and I was locked in the bathroom. And ever since then, I can't stand a locked door.
It really must have been a pretty rough start for a little girl.
It wasn't just all marvelous.
But this man changed everything. Loyal Davis, a wealthy Chicago surgeon. Mrs. Reagan's mother married him and reclaimed her then 7-year-old daughter. Davis would later adopt Nancy and become a major influence on her life.
A lot of my values, a lot of my beliefs, a lot of what I think is important in life, I got from him. Integrity, the value of integrity, the value of doing the best job you can, no matter what the situation is, no matter what's presented to you, no matter where life takes you.
Davis remained a central figure for Mrs. Reagan the rest of his life. His death in 1982 was one of the lowest points in the First Lady's difficult start at the White House.
When it got to the end, and I went to Phoenix and took him to the hospital. And my mother, we told my mother he was going to have some tests. And I stayed there, and he died around 9 o'clock in the morning. I'd never seen anybody die before, and I'd certainly never seen anybody I loved. And then after that, I was afraid that my mother would hear it. And my mother would hear it on television or the radio. And I didn't want that to happen.
Do you miss him very much?
Very much. Very much. Even now, I mean...
Loyal Davis gave his daughter a life of privilege. She attended a top private school and graduated from Smith College, class of 1943. But unlike many classmates, Nancy Davis did not get married right out of school. She went to Hollywood. There, something typical of the times happened. In her MGM studio biography, 2 years were shaved off her birth date, a change Mrs. Reagan has stuck with ever since.
One of the questions that people ask about you is the great birth date controversy. Your official biography says you were born in 1923.
Right.
Birth records in New York City, and your own son,
Yeah.
how sharper than a serpent's tooth, say you were born 2 years earlier.
Oh, well, he wasn't there.
Well, which is it?
I haven't made up my mind yet.
Are you fudging 2 years?
I'm not. I haven't made up my mind yet.
That's a non-committal
That's a pretty good answer,
Yeah,
isn't
it's
it?
not bad.
Not bad. Now you make me a promise.
Anything?
Don't get your hair cut so often and so short. Back of your neck feels like a porcupine.
The back of yours feels like velvet.
In the 1940s and 50s, Nancy Davis made 11 feature films. Some of them were quite good.
But if we didn't go and something happened, we both suffer for the rest of our lives. If I'm wrong, we've wasted a taxi ride. It's as simple as that.
Not to me, it isn't.
You were all she has in the world, and you're cruel to her. That's really a sin to be punished.
What are you just frightened? It's the false flavor. That's
Not that at all. It's God. Then why shouldn't I be frightened?
what kind of God would want to frighten you?
Look at me, Joe, and be honest. Tell me if you're not frightened.
Jan, check the oscillograph.
But some of them are best forgotten.
The curve's firm and normal.
Honey, take a look. Something, kid. A brain without a body. Alive.
Wonderful.
Nancy Davis found her best role, though, in 1952, starting what has been a 33-year run as Mrs. Ronald Reagan. She had 2 children of her own, plus 2 children from her husband's first marriage to actress Jane Wyman. And she began acting less frequently.
I don't want him good.
By 1961, Mrs. Reagan's career was down to an occasional TV production with her husband.
Don't touch her.
The family squabbles were not only on film. Over the years, and even in the White House, Mrs. Reagan has had problems with her children. It's apparently patched up now, but last Thanksgiving, son Michael accused Mrs. Reagan of being jealous, that he is the offspring of a prior marriage. And he complained that the president and first lady had never seen his daughter, who was then almost 2.
It has seemed over the last 4 years as if one of you is always in the doghouse.
When you're in the first family, family squabbles are like having arguments in a bass drum. I mean, it just reverberates out. You can't have it behind a closed door.
The main thing is that you try to solve them. And hopefully you do. But you know, you're lucky if you have a private life and you can do it privately rather than in the papers.
The people who know Mrs. Reagan best think the insecurity of her own childhood, the painful separation from her mother, have deeply affected how she feels about family.
It's given her a desire for a close family and a family structure that's idealized in a certain way, and one that no family can really live up to.
And it's always been difficult for me to understand how children could turn against their mother, or be separated from their mother. I never could understand that.
Because when you'd wanted your mother, you couldn't have her.
And for all those others who had their mothers, I want to say to them, you're so lucky. You're just so lucky. You've had all those wonderful years that I never had.
The next governor of the state of California, Ronald Reagan.
Mrs. Reagan's strong sense of family translated, in the case of her husband, into active involvement in his political career.
My wife, Nancy.
From the start, Mrs. Reagan was certain he was the best man for the job, whether the job was governor of California or president of the United States.
Reagan for president. Reagan for president.
One former aide said she watched over Mr. Reagan like a tigress protecting her cub. She always provided the stable, affectionate home base he needed. And behind her public image as the adoring wife, she was a tough and savvy advisor. As the two of them complete a remarkable career in politics, insiders say Mrs. Reagan was indispensable.
I sometimes think that if there weren't a Nancy Reagan, there wouldn't be a President Ronald Reagan, or maybe even have been a Governor Ronald Reagan.
She's watched out for him. She's taken care of him. She's taken care of the details. She's worried, and worried for him. And it's because of that they are both where they are today.
Do you think she wanted the presidency more than he did?
I think that she wanted him to be president probably more than he wanted to be president.
Is she more ambitious for him than he is? It's been suggested she is the driving force.
Yes, in this carefully specified sense, that she thinks he's absolutely unique. And under the circumstances, she probably thinks he belongs to Mount Rushmore.
So help me God. Now, congratulations, sir.
My mom always told me, Christy, if you want your hair full of body, try Prel. But I didn't listen. I had to try tons of shampoos. And guess what? My mom was right. When it comes to leaving my hair full of body, nobody beats Prel. Prel's got bodybuilders to leave my hair clean and in great shape. Look, that's body. Prel does so much more than get my hair clean. It's the bodybuilder. Mom knows best.
After playing against some pretty tall competition, you probably think I shower with the deodorant soap. Not anymore, because I made a break from deodorant soaps. A clean break with Ivory. Look inside. Ivory's a basic natural soap. Not like soaps that leave deodorants or heavy perfumes all over you. With Ivory, I feel clean, I smell clean. And that's an honest clean.
Make a clean break with Ivory. No soap can get you cleaner, no matter what size the competition.
This NBC News special will continue in a moment.
Sunday, a world movie premiere in the tradition of Rambo.
You can get away with murder here.
One man against an entire town. Code of Vengeance, Sunday.
This week, will Cruz resort to force to win back the love he so desperately needs?
Don't touch me.
You wanted as much as I did. Santa Barbara. This is a Channel 2 News Update with Bill Viasa.
Coming up in our cover story tonight at 10, another case of child abuse in Houston has focused attention on an old predicament. Child abuse is a crime, but psychologists say it's also a sickness. Is the child abuser therefore a criminal or a patient? We'll examine that question. Now this.
In 1914, Isuzu lost the first car race in Japan to a horse. Today, Isuzu's Turbo Impulse is getting even.
Cover story, together with the day's news, weather, and sports at 10.
Come on, boys. Come on.
In the universal search for great taste,
It doesn't take a higher intelligence to figure out why one coal is changed and one coal is chosen. Pepsi, the choice of a new generation.
Here's a special offer from American Express Traveler's Checks.
American Express is teaming up with many local banks, credit unions, and savings and loans to give you some valuable vacation extras.
When you buy $500 in American Express Traveler's Checks, you get $50 off 2 Eastern Airlines round-trip tickets, a free roll of Kodak film, and free processing.
So take advantage of this special offer when you go to buy American Express Traveler's Checks for your vacation.
Here are some of the participating financial institutions.
Should sex abusers be treated or punished? Cover story tonight at 10.
It's Friday night at Camp David, and the Reagans are enjoying one of their favorite pastimes here, watching a movie like two high school kids on a date. The film tonight, Lord Jim, one of the president's favorites. These are good times for the First Lady, whether at Camp David or at the California Ranch, where the Reagans also like to relax.
Flowers?
Careful of my lilacs.
Where's your buckthorn?
Well, they smell.
Having gotten past their last election ever with a landslide victory, the Reagans are enjoying their good fortune together.
We always hear about the great romance between the two of you, 33 years, and yet we keep hearing about you getting each other presents like pickup trucks for anniversaries. Why?
What don't you, hasn't your wife always wanted
a pickup truck?
A pickup truck and a power saw and a lawnmower and...
Go ahead, tell her the Fiesta
and a manure spreader?
Whether joking about her marriage or washing the family dog Lucky, Mrs. Reagan has grown comfortable in her role as First Lady. So comfortable, it's easy to forget how rocky a start she had in Washington 4 years ago.
Oh, I just lost my wedding ring.
When her problems seem much tougher to solve than they do now.
My wedding ring is in here. Oh, I found it.
Do you think you're more self-confident?
Yes, because I think maybe more people like me.
And it's easier to be a little more...
If I think people like me, I'm better.
I mean, you're willing to open up?
Yeah.
Back in 1981, it was the press that opened up, hitting Mrs. Reagan with a barrage of criticism. One of the big issues, the First Lady spent more than $800,000, much contributed by friends, fixing up the White House. The problem was largely one of timing. Mrs. Reagan started her lavish redecoration just as her husband started cutting programs for the poor, and just as the country started sliding into recession. For many people, this contrast made the First Lady look frivolous, or even worse, insensitive.
Mrs. Annenberg, my son David.
That image was reinforced by Mrs. Reagan's circle of friends, most of them wealthy Californians like publisher Walter Annenberg and his wife Lee, or Betsy Bloomingdale, perhaps Mrs. Reagan's best friend. Another longtime friend, Harriet Deutsch.
The First Lady, she's one of the greatest, darlingest friends that anybody in the world could have. Anybody that's privileged enough to know her is very lucky. To have her as a friend is beyond anybody's fondest dream of a friend.
And there was Mrs. Reagan's taste for $5,000 designer dresses, which caused some to start calling her Queen Nancy. Within months, she had grown sensitive about even mentioning her clothes, within range of reporters.
Real blast I wore last night. For Mrs. Thatcher, I'm going to wear. Are we still on?
As she looks back now on all the criticism, Mrs. Reagan shares the blame for her problems with the media.
I'm saying that I think there was probably fault on either side. I held back, and maybe they went forward a little bit too quickly.
Then came March 30th, 1981.
I remember everything about it. I can remember the sounds in the hospital. I remember the confusion, the voices, the people running back and forth, the police telling people to get away, wanting to see my husband, and being told I couldn't.
He was very seriously injured, much more seriously than anybody knew at that time.
Oh, I remember everything. Going into the operating room, and I remember everything, the smells, everything.
And she sat there in that hospital all day long, and every 2 hours they would go in and they would physically pound on his back to try to get the lungs to release this fluid that they were building up. And you could hear this. It was like somebody slapping a side of beef. And she just sat there and she said, "That's your father. They're doing that too."
With the combination of all that criticism and then the assassination attempt, how beaten down were you in 1981?
I was pretty beaten down. I was pretty beaten down. And then I knew my father was ill, and I was pretty beaten down.
In that first year, she started to lose weight. She was very tense. She wouldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. I don't know what she was down to, but it was probably 95 pounds or something. She was quite thin and tired a lot because she couldn't sleep.
As I look back on it, I think I was in a state of shock much longer than I realized I was.
As the president regained his health, there was one more public relations disaster. The White House received over $200,000 worth of donated china. The news coming just one day before the administration tried to have ketchup declared a vegetable for school lunch programs.
And the press took the White House China issue and made it symbolic that this would be a regal presidency. And they used Nancy Reagan very much as that symbol.
By October of 1981, Mr. Reagan was forced to defend his wife at a news conference.
The China. Let's set that straight once and for all, because Nancy's taken a bit of a bum rap on that.
The president's men grew concerned that Nancy Reagan was becoming the focus of the fairness issue. The charge that the Reagan White House favored the rich. They feared she was turning into a political liability.
Well, I'm told that in late '81 that you and Mike Deaver sat down, in effect, to work out a plan for Mrs. Reagan to dispel this image.
We felt, at least I did, that if Nancy Reagan became better known, the real Nancy Reagan became better known, she would be much better liked, that she would provide some political leverage and some strong support to the presidency.
What the president's image makers called the real Nancy Reagan was unveiled within days at the Al Smith dinner in New York.
There's now a picture postcard of me as a queen. Now that's silly, because I'd never wear a crown. It messes up your hair.
That comment, Chris, was a turnaround for her. Namely, she was able to take a charge that I think hurt her and diffuse it through humor.
But that was nothing compared to the gridiron dinner the following March. Dressed like some bag lady, Mrs. Reagan sang a version of Secondhand Rose and smashed a china plate on stage.
She walked on that stage and people were so astonished. They just rose from their seats and started screaming.
I remember I was scared to death.
You could feel the attitude change in that room.
Do you think that what you wanted to accomplish that night, you did?
Well, they applauded.
They were soon applauding something more important, as the First Lady launched a campaign against drug abuse, a longtime interest of hers. Mrs. Reagan says White House advisors oppose the project as too depressing. But some of those advisors indicate they saw it as a good way to bolster her image.
She went out on the road. She invited the press to come with her. She took the camera that you were shining on her and turned it around and shined it on a cause.
Some people are going to say that's public relations.
I would stop short of using the phrase public relations program.
Whatever her initial motivation, Mrs. Reagan has become involved in that cause. Since 1982, she has traveled 70,000 miles and visited 44 cities, preaching that parents must help their children resist drugs. Some Democrats say the First Lady has been used to cover up a cut in federal funds for drug treatment. But the number of parent groups fighting drugs has grown from 300 to 8,000. as Mrs. Reagan has taken her message even to a situation comedy.
Action.
Who's talking about Mrs. Reagan?
Well, I happened to be here in New York, and I saw that story about you in the paper, Arnold. I'm concerned about drug abuse, especially among the young.
How does the 26th of September?
The First Lady now has a staff as hard driving as her husband's, arranging events months in advance. And their boss, these staffers say, keeps asking for more.
The day after the election, she was on the phone to me. Now, what's our strategy for next year? Where am I going on drug abuse? We've got to get a plan together.
The plan, it turned out, was to take Mrs. Reagan's campaign international. This spring, she organized an anti-drug summit for First Ladies.
1, 2, 3, 4.
And showed her concern for every detail.
These tables are going to be covered with something, aren't they?
On Summit Day, Mrs. Reagan stood where her husband usually stands, at the White House diplomatic entrance, welcoming the wives of 17 foreign leaders. The emotional climax of the conference came when a 16-year-old former drug addict told the First Ladies about being hospitalized for an overdose.
I kept thinking, dear God, if you just don't let me wake up, I can't see her face again, because I was so sick of the disappointment every time that she looked at me.
But the centerpiece of the First Lady's spring offensive was her visit to the Pope last month to talk about drugs. Aides noted she wore a business suit instead of a long dress and veil because she was there on business. And the woman who used to say her life began when she met her husband and who had seen the Pope before with the president was clearly pleased to have made this trip on her own.
Well, it was, I think, one of the most moving, wonderful experiences I've ever had. I've met him twice before, but this is the first time, obviously, alone.
And what was so special about this?
Being alone. Talking about something that concerns me very much and concerns him, and hearing his views on it and his comments about what I'm doing.
Does he think what you're doing is important?
Yes.
Under this snow, there's more oil than in Saudi Arabia. 20 years ago, Sun Company developed a process to get oil from tar sands. Since then, a lot's developed around here. Jobs, a community, hockey teams. The energy's not just under the snow, it's everywhere, even on the ice. At Sun, we think that putting our energy back into a community is just as important as getting it out. Where there's sun, there's energy.
The Honda Prelude. Some people like to drive it wide open.
Signal mouthwash has so much mint, you can feel how fresh your breath is.
Signal if you feel it. Signal if you feel it. Signal if you feel more mint.
The other day, my boyfriend was touching my skin, and he said, "You feel so smooth and so good," and that's when I told him I'd been using Dove.
Dove is 1/4 moisturizing cream. It doesn't dry your face like soap.
Dove is better than soap, a whole lot better. There's no doubt about it.
How do you think, when it's all said and done, she will rank among First Ladies?
Well, with me, number one.
Nancy Reagan's husband has no problem assessing her place in history. But for the rest of us, the job is not so easy. Part of the problem is there is nothing in the Constitution about the First Lady, no definition of her duties. So each one is judged against her predecessors and the changing standard for women at the time. Eleanor Roosevelt created the expectation that First Ladies should have a cause. Traveling the country to help the poor, she was her husband's eyes and ears. Jacqueline Kennedy set a different standard. She did not care for the spotlight.
I understand that at one time you were a roving photographer in Washington. Is that right?
That's right.
Does all of this bother you at all?
I'd rather be on that end of it than this, I think.
But her style and support for the arts made her a glamorous figure. For Betty Ford, it was her outspoken backing of women's issues.
My own support of the Equal Rights Amendment has shown I do not believe that being First Lady should prevent me from expressing my ideas.
Rosalind Carter was deeply involved in her husband's administration, even representing him abroad.
My visit to Colombia is an indication of the importance that Jim and I both place on good relationships with youth.
She was the first presidential wife to regularly attend cabinet meetings, which provoked a lot of criticism. Mrs. Reagan is preferred to work behind the scenes, but that hasn't stopped the critics. Feminists like Betty Friedan, who went to Smith College with Mrs. Reagan, complain that the former career woman now lives the old way, through her man.
As First Lady, she is an anachronism. I mean, she is somehow not only denying her earlier reality, but the reality of American women today and what they want to be and what they need to be and what I think they would like to see represented in the First Lady.
Any feminist that thinks that Nancy Reagan is a bad role model is not a feminist. Could never be considered a feminist. Feminism is the choice to be what you can be and to do what you can do, and to be able to make those choices for yourself.
But an expert on the role of First Ladies says this argument is beside the point.
It's very unlikely that Ronald Reagan would have as his wife someone like Betty Friedan, or even for that matter, Rosalind Carter. Ronald Reagan is a particular kind of man, and that particular kind of man would choose as his wife someone like Nancy Reagan.
After a rough start, the American people apparently like Ronald Reagan's choice. In 1981, a poll found people approved of the way Mrs. Reagan was handling her responsibilities, 57% to 26%, a margin of 2 to 1. But an NBC News poll conducted for this program found people now approve of her 69% to 9%, almost 8 to 1. And a strong majority of women, both housewives and those working outside the home, now thinks Mrs. Reagan sets a good example for women. Where do Americans rank her? In 1981, they put her 4th among the 6 most recent First Ladies. But in our new poll, she rose to 2nd place, trailing only Jacqueline Kennedy. Mrs. Reagan's change of image is obviously working, emphasizing her fight against drugs rather than her fancy lifestyle. A longtime observer of the First Lady questions how deep it goes.
I don't think that Nancy Reagan has changed any. I think this is the same Nancy Reagan we saw 4 years ago. I think what has changed is her realization of how she comes across to the public, and she's just become smarter.
She knows how the game is played now.
She knows how it's played.
But one of the people involved in Mrs. Reagan's turnaround sees a profound change in the First Lady.
I think she understands better now than she did at the beginning that she is in a position for the first time in her life to be more than just Mrs. Ronald Reagan, that she can do something with her life independently which can make a change for the good.
Whether it's public relations or personal growth, Mrs. Reagan plans to keep at it. Aides expect her to hold another anti-drug summit for First Ladies this fall, and to make more foreign trips by herself. And she says she will also keep an eye on her husband's White House staff. In fact, the person who talks most about her growth in the last 4 years is the First Lady herself.
I don't know how you could help but not grow. You're exposed to so many different things and so many different people, so many different experiences. I mean, in a way, even the negative things that all happened in the beginning were probably part of a growth process. you know?
How do you explain the fact that people seem to like and be impressed with Nancy Reagan now?
Well, I hope they like and like me. But I think it's been a process of getting to know me, and that took a long time.
One thing that struck us the last few months was Mrs. Reagan's new interest in letting people know her. She now clearly wants the public to understand who she is, where she comes from, what she can do. The First Lady does not admit to any personal ambition, but there are signs of a woman who wants to be more than just a support system for her husband. Mrs. Reagan will never satisfy the feminists, but in a sense she has been liberated by her new popularity, by her greater awareness of the platform she has, by the fact that she'll never have to face another election. As the Reagan presidency plays out then, Nancy Reagan will likely have a bigger and bigger role, committed to securing not only the president's place in history, but also her own. For NBC News, I'm Chris Wallace. Good night.
Sally?
Michael? Oh, it's been a long time.
Gosh, sure has. Gosh, you look terrific.
Your hair looks terrific. Thicker, fuller. Because Affinity Shampoo helps renew the fullness hair can lose as it gets older. Affinity helps protect hair from breaking and thinning, so your hair can be thicker, fuller.
Oh, you had some good times.
You still look terrific.
Renew the fullness with Affinity Shampoo.
They call this cattle country. It's also where a lot of America's coal is. So when Sun Company built the Cordero mine here, folks worried about the future of the land. But Sun also developed this land reclamation center to make sure the land is properly restored. At Sun, we think putting our energy back into the land is just as important as getting it out.
Where there's sun, there's energy.
On Days of Our Lives, Melissa's new lover has a secret that's about to be revealed. What will Melissa do now? Days of Our Lives. Then, on another world, it was a reunion they never dreamed of.
My sister. My twin sister.
But will a secret tear them apart this week? Wednesday, the Hollywood dream stripped bare. The real-life story of 5 girls struggling for stardom. How far will they go reaching for the stars? Wednesday.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ron Stone. Next on Channel 2 News at 10 o'clock, a barrage of threats has forced Houston's Islamic community to go to the mayor for help tonight.
I'm Bill Baeza. Jan Carson has the night off. We'll also hear tonight from several hostages who are being seen and heard from for the first time since the hijacking. That and more news next on Channel 2 News at 10.
NBC News produced this program and is responsible for its content.
I'm Bryant Gumbel. Tomorrow morning on Today, we'll check all the overnight developments in the Beirut hostage crisis.
I'm Jane Pauley, and more of our talk with Clint Eastwood.
Join us tomorrow morning on Today.
A summer of tennis whites on a sea of green. A day of championship tennis. A Wimbledon afternoon, Saturday on NBC.
For all those people who never could warm up to computers, Lotus introduced